Good afternoon. My name is Pat Christmas. I'm the Chief Policy Officer at the Committee of 70. It is election day. It's about 1 o'clock. Polls have been open for about 6 hours. We have another 7 hours to go. Polls close at 8 o'clock across Philly and across the Commonwealth. We're going to be live here at the Committee of 70's offices and our digital Studio C70 all day, talking to folks who work on actually a range of different topics in a range of different areas related to democracy, elections, and just local government. Right now we have the pleasure of welcoming John Kromer, who's the former director of housing here in Philly from 1992 to 2001, and has done all sorts of works on all sorts of projects related to housing development, the city's growth, or at times like the lack thereof, and is going to help us start to try to understand, I hope, some really complicated challenges we're dealing with right now, and then we'll be dealing with ahead. Yeah, John, you're also the author of a new book, right? Fixing Broken Cities.
Correct.
All right, and by the end, we'll make sure folks know where to get a copy for themselves before we sign off. So let's start with this, and knowing that we don't have a great deal of time to chat, but to kind of paint the landscape for this conversation, the recent history, at least, of the city's growth and development, because the challenges and consequently the debates we're having right now are already quite different from what they were 20 years ago and 20 years before that. So kind of in a nutshell, could you kind of take us through what the past, again, like 20, 30, 40 years have looked like for the city of Philadelphia in terms of, again, growth and development?
I could do that in about 40 or 50 seconds. It shouldn't be a problem.
Right.
But I think it's appropriate that it's election day today, and the political dynamic just runs through everything that happened with respect to housing and development during the past 75 years. And so for people who are watching this, who are not involved in political activity in some way, I would really urge you to rethink your activities. You may work for a government or a nonprofit organization. That does not prevent you from becoming an activist. And I think the biggest political success of 2022 was achieved by the Committee of 70 and Fair Districts PA in enabling the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to come up with a legislative redistricting map that was actually fair and made sense. And the outcomes, the beneficial outcomes of that were apparent in the most recent statewide elections. So I think people ignore the worth of state representatives and senators, of the Commonwealth Court, of the state Supreme Court at their peril. What those characters do will have a lot of influence over issues like public safety, kids, crime, drugs, and the election process itself. Having said that, to answer your question, Philadelphia's economic trajectory, has really been interesting during the past, most of the past century. During the first centuries of Philadelphia's existence, it was all about growth. Every decade, there was growth in population, jobs, businesses, starting in the 1800s and continuing well into the 1900s, but then coming to a stop in around 1950 and then reversing itself, so that in every decade, there was a decline in population, there was business loss, there was job loss, there was an increase in poverty. So think about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and just imagine being in that position. And the question in a lot of people's minds was, is this going to end? Or is this the end of Philadelphia? This was really an unprecedented kind of catastrophe, and past experience really offered no clue about how to move forward. So Fixing Broken Cities was all about that crisis and about the high-risk strategies that the city and others undertook to try to address that challenge. And it includes city policies like the 10-year tax abatement, but also institutional initiatives like Penn's West Philadelphia initiatives, which resulted in the creation of, among other things, the Penn Alexander School, as well as other strategies that were tested and implemented, some with great success, some with mixed results. And I think the 10-year tax abatement is a good example of that, which we can discuss in a minute. But if you think of that period, sort of decade by decade, it was a scary time. But on the other hand, in the 1960s, Society Hill was developed, an urban renewal plan that focused almost exclusively on preservation of existing housing. It was a time when Yorktown in North Philadelphia was developed, producing hundreds of home ownership opportunities for Black families that had been shut out of the suburban housing market, as well as the completion of the commuter tunnel, very creative ventures like the linking of the Reading Terminal Market as a lunchtime destination, as well as a traditional farmers market, to the newly completed commuter tunnel. Interestingly, I was asking a former Philadelphian what he thought were some of the greatest planning and design achievements of the last half century. He had left Philadelphia about 30 years ago, and his answer was the Schuylkill River Trail. So wouldn't have been my first guess, but if you could think of an amenity like that and the powerful sort of opportunity that it represents for real estate development, recreation, and social life, it's a relevant response.
Yeah. You know what, John, I'm really glad actually you went back much farther than the timeline I gave you, because it's especially the last century and that latter half where the city was either declining or stagnant is pretty central to kind of where we are today, obviously, where I don't think that we didn't go through a comprehensive planning process for most of that 50 years, largely because we were just we were shrinking. And you mentioned, so also I guess we should stress here at the outset, your book is all about not just growth and development, but that history and then how we guide equitable growth going forward, right? In a market-based economy, how can we ensure growth happens in such a way that not only that everybody benefits, but especially those folks who have not benefited in the past, that they get the benefits kind of upfront as the city changes. So this tax abatement policy was put in place at the turn of the century, right? And is both kind of objectively a very powerful development tool, but has become quite controversial as well. So can you take us through where this policy came from, both and why it's kind of powerful and spurring development, but also why it's controversial too?
Yeah. Again, if you can imagine the 1980s and an empty downtown after 5 p.m. and more businesses moving out and more older office buildings being vacated or reduced to a very low level of occupancy, then I think you can get an understanding of how desperate of the investors in Center City, local investors who really cared about Philadelphia, as well as some of the city leadership felt about this. And during that time, a lot of different incentives were attempted to lure development back downtown. And the 10-year tax abatement was just the latest of those. And it worked very effectively. It was introduced in 1997 on a very limited basis in a target area of Center City and focused only on encouraging the conversion of older office buildings to investment properties, meaning primarily rental. So the idea was to convert empty office space to rental apartments. Does this sound familiar, by the way, in terms of today's predicament? It was much easier then because, as Paul Levy and others have pointed out, the floor plan of the older office buildings is much more conducive to that kind of conversion than the expansive floor plans of some of the more recently developed buildings, which have a lot of dark interior space, which would be more difficult to use. So the tax abatement was just an attempt that was proposed on a limited basis. It worked well during the tail end of the 20th century. And then in 2000, City Council approved the expansion of the tax abatement, really to include everything, rehabilitation, new construction, any property in the city, improvement to occupied properties, as well as vacant properties. and new construction on vacant land. And the market really took off, in part because of that incentive, in part because on a national and regional level, things were getting a lot better. And the result was what you see now, which I think no one would have dreamed of in 2000, at a time when the city was still struggling and wondering about its future. The great thing about the tax abatement was its simplicity. It was very easy to find out whether you were going to be eligible or not. The application at that time was 1 page. It may be longer now, it may not be. It didn't require city council approval. Nobody else had to get their finger into the deal. And you could just do your job and take the incentive, which became available upon completion of the project and a certificate of occupancy. So it really made a lot of sense. I feel badly about the circumstances under which the tax abatement was changed in this compromise involving some of the building industry and city council. Without going into that in detail, one of the things it did was to create an impact fee, just what we need. Another reason not to do development in Philadelphia. You're going to get taxed on the value of your investment. And then secondly, it cut in half the value of the abatement for certain properties. And I think a lot of people would agree that that makes a lot of sense with respect to 500 Walnut Street and the very high-end properties. But a lot of those properties were smaller and mid-sized rental properties, which we need as part of our affordable housing portfolio. But the owners of those properties were, in effect, seeing their tax bill doubled over 10 years because of that change. So I think, unfortunately, this was a success for city council members, but not for the administration. And I think it illustrates how important it is for the city administration, starting with the mayor, to get deeply involved in negotiations like that. They really matter, and you can't be out of the room when some of these agreements are made.
Yeah. So just with that, I mean, we get a sense of just how complicated and high stakes the politics are around these issues, and then also the tension you just brought out there about this particular sort of policy, how it was quite important to spur development, spur economic activity, especially 20 years ago. And there was seems like there's plenty of grounds for some discussion about where and how to change it. But in this case, it was changed apparently got more through a political discussion as opposed to a policy discussion. But to figure out for city residents, making sure it works for those folks who most need housing, and I guess to increase supply, right? I guess that's another theme of what we're going to need in the years ahead, is more housing units of all sorts of different types, both market rate, affordable workforce housing for many years ahead to keep prices down. So you mentioned council there. I mean, one thing I wanted to touch on, again, as big as these topics are, just briefly with you, is that Council President Darrell Clark, who was of course finishing up his last year in his last term here, announced just a couple years ago a neighborhood preservation initiative, a several $100 million program to do all sorts of things, but one of which was, and to its name, to preserve housing we already have, which is an important policy priority. And it sounds pretty similar, and it surely is somewhat similar to his former boss, former council president, and then former mayor John Street, who launched a neighborhood transformation initiative, which somewhat different objectives. But I guess my question for you around these sorts of initiatives is that what are the advantages for these sorts of projects, these endeavors coming forward, especially coming from city council? And then what can we say as far as their successes or their shortcomings, to the extent we can assess that?
Well, the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, John Street's proposal, really was introduced during the mayoral campaign, right, when he was running to succeed Ed Rendell. I don't think there was any guarantee that he was going to be successful in the mayor's race. And so I think it was a very bold move to propose investing in neighborhoods at that time when neighborhoods were not in such great condition in much of the city, and to say we're going to make a substantial commitment of city wealth to upgrade these neighborhoods. So I think Mayor Street deserves a lot of credit for that. And NTI, as it was called, previous mixed results. Some things didn't work out, some things did. One thing that was successful was the mayor's attempt to lure private developers into the city, for the first time in decades, by assembling parcels of vacant land, sometimes including vacant buildings that had to be demolished, and making them available for development of the type that the city wanted to see. In many instances, new construction home ownership. And I think the Brewery Town development in the vicinity of 31st and Girard, north of Girard, is one example of that, in which industrial buildings were demolished, the land was cleaned up, and the site was made available to a suburban developer, John Wistrom, who produced housing that was really of high quality and was available to the private market. The other thing that the street administration did was just to issue bonds to finance housing development. Prior to that time, I'm not sure the city would have been able to do so based on its financial condition, but by 2000, the financial condition had improved quite a bit, and it was possible to think about that. But back in the 20th century, there wasn't going to be any discussion of putting city money or issuing bonds to support anything like affordable housing. So that's really to his credit.
Mhm.
One more thing that the street administration accomplished was to introduce the idea of greening vacant lots, sometimes on an interim basis, just to clean them up and produce something that looked nice. It has had a tremendous impact on neighborhoods, and it's been a lasting impact just to convey the message that somebody cares about this piece of land. That message is really respected for the most part, and has produced a lot of great results.
Mhm. Mhm.
With respect to Darrell Clark's initiative, now it's not that unusual to propose issuing bonds to support development. And I think the next step is to consider sort of a people-based approach rather than a property-based approach, and to think not so much in terms of neighborhood plans as in terms of addressing housing need on a citywide basis. And I think that's really the intent of the plan with respect to a number of its components. And I think it's similar to the state legislation that Senator Nikhil Sawal spearheaded that provides money for housing preservation. So freeing up a lot of capital to preserve existing housing, to help keep people in their homes, and to do so without a lot of strings attached. I think one of the great lessons of the Kenney administration under the leadership of Ann Fedelian and Greg Heller as then head of the redevelopment authority was in connection with the eviction prevention program, in which the city was making available dollars to help pay the rent for people who, under the circumstance of the pandemic, weren't able to afford keeping up with their rental payments. And the initial approach was to require the tenant to apply and the landlord to sign off on the paperwork. And for various reasons, part two didn't happen to a great extent. And so the program stalled and was in effect being held up by the landlords. And so the city decided just to go ahead based on the tenant's application. And it worked extremely well. And I think in response to the question of, well, how many of those tenants, bought a plane ticket and had a big vacation in the Caribbean? Probably not. They're worrying about feeding their kids and buying clothes for their family, paying the heating bill as well as the rent. So I think that kind of approach, where there's certainly a level of oversight, but a level of confidence that there's a genuine need out there that needs to be addressed, and an infusion of capital on a household by household scale is the way to go. So I think NPI could help achieve that.
Yeah. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I guess one thing I wanted to get just a little bit more commentary from you on is we are of course about to elect our next mayor with the Democratic primary today, of course, but then we'll have a mayor elect by November of 2023 of this year. You know, what would be the most important thing you'd want to hear from that person, the mayor elect? I mean, we're gonna have two major party primary winners today, but of that mayor elect on the issue of equitable growth and development. Going forward when they're about to take the reins of power?
Well, I think the most important thing for the next mayor to do is to understand that she or he really has to get into the thick of these issues. And I think the situation with University City townhomes is a good case in point. The mayor really has to get at the table in a situation like that early on, before the council person sues the city and the discussion stops dead. The mayor has to call everybody into the room and say, we have to figure this out. And it frequently won't be pretty and will involve some concessions that the city may not have planned to make. But Penn can't do that. The developer can't do that. The developer was following the rules. The only person that can drag everybody to the table is the mayor. And so that understanding with respect to affordable housing and economic development has to be the first thing. The second thing, sort of related, is the mayor has to work things out with city council. It has to be a partnership. The mayor can't continue defaulting policy decisions to city council. Council members are not good policymakers for various reasons. It's not because they're bad people. They're just not in a position where they can make policy and implement it with the degree of effectiveness that the mayor could take. So those are my top two.
I think those points are really well taken, and especially again coming back to the beginning of our conversation here, and then one of the themes of your book. If equitable growth, equitable development is a goal and a value for the city, that doesn't happen on its own, right? If local government takes a passive role to change, it's not going to be value aligned change. So I think those points are very well taken. And then also, of course, we got two branches of government here here in City Hall, and both of them have roles to play in this, both of them. So all right, we're about to sign off. John, you do have a new book, Fixing Broken Cities. Where can folks get a copy?
Check Amazon. I think there are copies in the free library and from the publisher, but it's available online, that's for sure.
All right, excellent. John, I know you've just taken a break from the polls to come join us. So thank you again so much, and we'll see you out there.
Great. Well, thanks. I think whoever takes office next year will be younger and more energetic, and I think that'll be great for everybody. Thank you.
Good chance of that. Thanks, John. Talk soon.
Right.